Good. Dean Jamal?
Yep.
Very good.
Are we good to go?
Very good.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Amani Jamal, the Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. On behalf of SPIA and the Afghanistan Policy Lab, I welcome you to this timely, important panel discussion. What we present today is a continuation of the discourse APL has facilitated over the last year on topics including the security environment in Afghanistan, the failing economic situation, the near collapse of the financial sector, and the hurdles in delivering humanitarian assistance there. Our focus is on the interconnectedness of these various critical issues on the present-day situation in Afghanistan, as well as their impact on the future of the country as a whole. Our panelists will pay special attention to the role of the United Nations in these spheres. We are fortunate to welcome such an experienced and knowledgeable group of speakers. Our keynote speaker is His Excellency Ambassador Ana Jimenez de la Hoz, Deputy Permanent Representative of Spain to the United Nations. Our panelists are Ambassador Edmund Fitton-Brown, former United Nations Security Council Coordinator, ISIL Al-Qaeda Taliban Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, and the former UK Ambassador to Yemen. Dr. Sue Eckert, Expert United Nations Security Council, ISIL Al-Qaeda Taliban Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, and the former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration, United States Government. Ms. Catherine Carey, Deputy Head of Office, United Nations Office of Humanitarian Affairs, Kabul, joining virtually from Kabul. Dr. Fernando Cavalcante, Political Affairs Officer, United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. All of us at SPIA are so grateful for your willingness to share your expertise and perspectives. Our moderator and one of our own is Dr. Arian Sharifi, a lecturer and associate research scholar here at SPIA, as well as the organizer of this discussion. Many thanks to Arian for his hard work in pulling this together. I turn the program over to him. Thank you.
Ready? Thank you very much, Dean Jamal, indeed, for the introduction, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. We really wish you could be here in person, but we completely understand the situation and wishing you a complete and fast recovery, inshallah, so we can have you back here on campus in person. Please also allow me to take this opportunity to thank our great panel here, including Her Excellency Ambassador Jimenez, who really took the time to come from New York, and Edmund from Austin, Texas. And also we have Kate there, who's joining us virtually from Afghanistan. She heads the humanitarian assistance operations of the United Nations there in Afghanistan. And so I appreciate all of you coming in here. I would like to start by requesting Her Excellency Ambassador Jimenez as our keynote speaker to start the program, and then we will dive right into the panel. Her Excellency.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Arian. Thank you very much to the Vice to the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs for the invitation, and also to the Dean for the kind introduction. And I also wish you feel better soon. From my side, what I intend to do in these introductory remarks is to try to frame the discussion around the counterterrorism measures from the point of view of the government of Spain, but also enlarging the scope to the UN and the role that member states, and particularly Spain, has had on this important topic. So I would say first that the importance of counterterrorism for Spain comes from our own internal situation, having experienced domestic terrorism for more than 4 decades. 2 key lessons learned from that process were, in the first place, the importance of cooperation among all actors, nationally, cooperation regionally and internationally. And the second issue was the importance of the recognition of victims of terrorism, and victims of terrorism from 2 points of view. On the one hand, as people who need the support, the assistance to recover and to be really, to overcome the terrible situation that they have faced, but also the recognition that victims of terrorism. No worries. Thank you so much. That victims of terrorism are very resilient agents of change who can play a key role in the public sphere. So in my presentation, I would like to focus on these two key issues. On the one hand, the international cooperation, then I will turn to the issue of victims of terrorism, and I will finish by highlighting some aspects on the situation in Afghanistan, again from the Spanish point of view. So when it comes to the UN, Spain has been very much committed to supporting, on the one hand, the UN architecture. The first important part of this architecture was establishment of the Executive Directorate of the Counterterrorism Committee. For all of those of you who maybe are not so familiar with the policy framework when it comes to terrorism, after the September 11 attacks, the UN Security Council passed a key landmark resolution, Resolution 1373, which established really the international framework on the fight against terrorism, and it creates also this executive directorate to implement the policy decisions taken by the committee, which is made of the 15 members of the Security Council, and to conduct missions, assessment missions to member states. So Spain had the honor to have the first executive director of this directorate, who himself was a victim or is a victim of terrorism. The second big initiative of Spain is the great support that it gives to the UN Office on Counterterrorism, and we are very pleased to host one of the program offices in Madrid, which was actually inaugurated very recently. When it comes to the intergovernmental sphere, the key instrument, the global, unique, overarching instrument that the UN has from an intergovernmental point of view is the Global Counterterrorism Strategy. It was established through a General Assembly resolution in 2006, and it contains a number of measures, a number of recommendations for member states for the fight against terrorism. Because the topic is so big, the strategy has 4 main pillars. The first one is about the conditions conducive to terrorism. The second one, the measures to combat and prevent terrorism. The third one, measures to build capacity in member states to combat and prevent terrorism. And the fourth one is measures to ensure that human rights and the rule of law are the basis for the fight against terrorism. So what is very important about this counterterrorism strategy is that it serves to take the temperature of member states every time it is reviewed. So in 2006, member states decided to undertake a review of the strategy every 2 years. So every 2 years, there's an intergovernmental negotiations involving all member states to take a look at the changing nature of the terrorism in the world, and to see what new elements are there, how they can come to a consensual agreement. And the second point is also very important. This is a consensual agreement of 193 member states. So for all of you who are maybe more familiar with the UN, this will be very obvious, but maybe for others, just to know that consensual resolutions carry a very important weight in the work of the United Nations, because they represent the will, the decisions of the whole membership. So far, every review has been taken place on a consensual basis, and it is really the hope of all of us that this will be the case this year again when the 8th review will take place. So in this context, in 2020, it was time for the 7th review of the global counterterrorism strategy. Because of the pandemic, member states thought that it was not a good idea to have an online negotiation, because as you can understand, this is a very sensitive topic. So member states themselves decided to postpone the review to 2021. In 2021, which was also a key year for the UN, it was the 75th anniversary of the UN, the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the landmark resolution that I mentioned, 1373, and the 15th anniversary of the establishment of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy. So that year, the President of the General Assembly appointed Spain and Oman as the two co-facilitators of the process. Again, for all of you who are maybe not so familiar with the UN, this is a very established procedure in the UN. It's like every time there's a big intergovernmental process of any kind, the President of the General Assembly appoints two co-facilitators, one from the north, the other one from the global south, to steer the process and to lead the intergovernmental negotiations. So in June 2021, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the 7th review of the counterterrorism strategy. It is a very interesting document in which there are around 34 new operational paragraphs. The operational paragraphs of the resolution are the ones in which the membership of the United Nations takes a number of important decisions. So among those, the main issues reflected on this in operational paragraphs are, for instance, the recognition of new threats, new and emerging threats. Some of them are connected to threats related to xenophobia, racism, other forms of intolerance, and a call on member states to take action. There's also recognition that new technologies can have a pernicious effect and can on terrorism, and there's also a need for member states to take a look at new technologies and to take additional measures in this regard. There's also new language on the call to mobilize resources to build capacity in member states to fight against terrorism, to adopt new frameworks, advocacy, etc. The issue of women was very difficult to negotiate during the 7th review, but there's also very strong language which recognizes, on the one hand, that the role that women have as women associated to foreign terrorist groups who come back to their countries of origin, and how they should be prosecuted according to the role that they played when they were associated, and that has to be taken into account for rehabilitation and other processes, and also the role of women as victims of terrorism, and in this respect, the need for them to receive the necessary assistance on a with a gender-based approach. There are also important provisions regarding the financing of terrorism, including the fact that every measure that member states take to fight and counter the funding of terrorism have to be taken within the frameworks of the relevant international law, and in any case, they shouldn't impact the delivery of impartial and principled humanitarian assistance by impartial humanitarian actors. There's also recognition about the role that the cultivation, traffic of illicit narcotic drugs can have in fueling the funding of terrorism. And there's also important language about the human rights as an overarching framework in counterterrorism. So those are sort of some of the main lines that I can describe in this regard. But I invite you all, if you are interested in this topic, to take a look at the 7th and latest review. And because now we are in 2023, 2 years have passed by, so the time has come for a next review of the global counterterrorism strategy. In this case, the two co-facilitators are Canada and Commission, and we will start actually the intergovernmental conversations very, very soon. As you can understand, the geopolitical context has changed, new threats are there. So that's why, as I mentioned before, it's very important for this exercise to be very sensitive to the international context and to make sure that whatever the UN decides is very much related to what is happening in the world. So we as Spain look forward to a 7th review that preserves the language that was already adopted, these very important provisions that I was mentioning before, and that as much as possible we can make some progress in key issues such as the role of civil society and the protection of human rights among others. So those are the main issues that I wanted to share with you when it comes to international cooperation, the role of the UN and the role that Spain has played in that field. And I will turn very quickly now to the second part of my intervention, which has to do with victims of terrorism. The role of victims, I think we can all agree that is absolutely key. Is key for remembrance, and that's a very important point, because sometimes in this evolving situation in which one crisis supersedes the previous one, we have to remember what happened in this field, and the victims are there to provide this testimony, to carry out advocacy efforts, and to have a very important influence on policy making based on their first-hand experience of what terrorism means. So in this regard, in the UN, we already have since 2017 established the 21st of August as the International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to Victims of Terrorism. Later on in 2019, Afghanistan had a very leading role in the adoption of a resolution to enhance international cooperation on the assistance of victims of terrorism, which calls for measures to be taken by member states, the role of civil society, the role of private sector. And after these important resolution, a group of friends on victims of terrorism was created. And again, a group of friends is the feature of the UN in which member states from a cross-regional spectrum come together around a topic that is important, it's important for themselves, and make sure that the topic stays high on the agenda of the UN. In this case, the group of friends was first co-chaired by Afghanistan and Spain, and since 2021 has been co-chaired by Spain and Iraq. And again, the group tries to keep this issue very high on the agenda, the rights of the victims of terrorism, the importance of education, of advocacy. It has more than 40 members, and it was with the support of this group and under the auspices of the UN Secretary General that on the 9th of September 2022, the first Global Congress on Victims of Terrorism took place in New York. It was a very important gathering in which all actors which have a role in terrorism, on the victims of terrorism, came together. Victims associations, the whole spectrum of civil society, member states, the UN system, of course, to come together to share experiences, lessons learned, priorities, threats, the importance of safety and security of victims, the importance of measures to address their issues. And three maybe key takeaways from that Congress were: the first was that there's going to be a handbook for member states on best practices on terrorism that is going to be elaborated by the UN during the course of this year. There's going to be also a network association of civil society organizations, so creating this network as a permanent structure that will allow for this, but for a better and more fluid exchanges among civil society. And third, there was positive consideration for the future establishment of a voluntary trust fund for victims of terrorism. So those are kind of the main issues that I wanted to share with you before turning very quickly to the question of Afghanistan. And on that, I would say that Spain is working very closely in the context of the European Union. There was a Foreign Affairs Council exactly a week from now, last Monday, and it was a decision by the Council to work on new agreed conclusions on the situation in Afghanistan. The latest ones are from September 2021 as a reaction to what happened in August last year. So now the time has come for more foreign ministers of the European Union to come together again and hopefully in March come up with new conclusions. And from the point of view of Spain, we want to avoid at all costs the normalization of the situation right now. We think that there's nothing normal about what's happening in Afghanistan, and that the international community has to remain very active on that portfolio. And last but not least, from the Spanish point of view, we are working very closely with Afghan women who have taken refuge in Spain, who are professionals, are lawyers, journalists, doctors, etc. So we have provided a mentoring capacity, mentoring space to them, so they can be part of Spanish society in the role that they had in Afghanistan the initiative is called Hear Us because we want to hear them and through them also to hear the voices of the women who can't speak right now, who don't have the right to participate in public life. And we're very concerned about the situation. And the second part of our work with women is the issue of accountability. So a week ago, actually in Madrid, there was the first workshop in which we brought together Spanish lawmakers, Spanish judicial experts, etc., with these women to see how we can start exploring judiciary and non-judiciary mechanisms of accountability, where the evidence that has been built can be brought up for consideration. So we make sure that what's happening right now can be prosecuted at the right instances. So those are some ideas that I'm offering to all of you and for the conversation today, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, indeed, for that comprehensive statement covering a broad range of issues, everything from the United Nations global counterterrorism strategy to the issue of the group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism, which is extremely key to Spain's role in the establishment of CTED, and finally on Afghanistan issue. That certainly sets the stage for our discussion here on the panel. So we have about an hour, a little over an hour, and I would request our four panelists here to perhaps maybe limit your interventions between 6 to 8 minutes, if that would be okay. And then so that we have 15, 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So Edward, let me start with you. I have two questions, but let me state that it's been over 18 months now that the Taliban are in power in Afghanistan. And at the same time, we keep hearing about the existence of some 20 or more foreign terrorist organizations that some of which may have been present before, but it seems that they are surviving and thriving under it. Meanwhile, we keep hearing about the divisions against the Taliban. So the two questions that I have for you: first, how do you assess these intra-Taliban divisions? What are they? If you could just tell our audience a little bit here about what these divisions are. And second, what those divisions actually mean when it comes to counterterrorism and the existence of these 20 terrorist groups or more in Afghanistan, particularly as highlighted by the UN, the monitoring team's latest report, the role of Al-Qaeda and ISIS there. Thank you.
Thanks, Arian. And we need to get closer. Is that sounding okay? Try not to move too far away. And okay, so Arian, and those questions which I'll address in the context of my remarks. And my thanks also to the ambassador and to the dean, of course. It's an honour and a pleasure to come to this great university and appear alongside these distinguished speakers on one of the key international security issues of our time. You've very kindly spotlighted the monitoring team here by including me as the former coordinator, and also my colleague Sue Eckert, who's the current US expert on the team. And I think it's important to just make sure the audience is aware of this mandate, just so that otherwise the monitoring team is not a household. So it works for the UN Security Council's committees dealing with the sanctions on ISIL, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, provides technical advice on sanctions implementation, and it's also the UN body responsible for assessing the threat that those groups pose. And to do that, it is uniquely the UN tasked to consult with member states' intelligence, security and other counter-terrorism agencies. Indeed, I vividly remember meeting with Arian when he was part of the National Security Council of Afghanistan, and I was leading a monitoring team visit to Kabul. Now, obviously, it was a tough brief covering Afghanistan over the latter part of my time. It was troubling to follow the US Taliban talks from 2019, where the US had signaled its desired end state of military withdrawal. And the Taliban offered no compromises or signs of good faith throughout the process. The Doha Agreement of 29th of February 2020 was a flawed agreement, and the Taliban proceeded to abuse the latitude it gave them throughout the period leading up to the US withdrawal in 2021 and their own takeover of the country. And as we reported, the monitoring team reported that very frankly at the time, the Taliban were always preparing for war. They were never preparing for negotiations for an inclusive peace. Now, I emphasize this because it set the tone for where we stand now with regard to the Taliban's approach to government, and especially its continuing collaborative relationship with terrorist groups in Afghanistan, with the exception of the Khorasan. The Taliban has always lied about the presence of Al-Qaeda and related groups in the country, and it has bizarrely chosen to sustain this lie by denying that there is any evidence that Ayman al-Zawahiri was killed in Kabul last summer. Since 2019, some internationals have argued that the Taliban should be co-opted as a counterterrorism partner, especially against ISIL-K. But it's difficult to embrace a counterterrorism partner that denies the scope of the problem. Not only would legal and ethical compliance with human rights and other vital aspects of counterterrorism be unachievable working directly with the Taliban, it wouldn't even be possible to reach a confident shared understanding of the threat picture. The Taliban want assistance, but they only want it on their terms. The new monitoring team report that was published earlier this month describes Afghanistan as the primary source of terrorist threat for Central and South Asia. And I concur with that. The threat emanates from ISIL-K, from Al-Qaeda, and from terrorist groups that are opposed to neighboring countries. And these latter include the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, AMU, the Tajik Jamaat Ansarullah, and the Uyghur Turkestan group, ETIM or TIP, depending on how you name it. And of course, then there are many other groups. Plus, perhaps it's a reasonable figure. Now, I consider that the threat that these groups pose to be more latent rather than absolutely current. Apart from some cross-border activity, it will take time for a serious projected international threat to evolve. But the intent is there, and the capability will follow in time unless the right measures are taken to prevent that from happening. Now, these groups and the many others present in Afghanistan are mostly aligned with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. ISIL-K is hostile to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but it's keen to recruit disaffected members from them and from the regionally focused groups. It has had great success, especially in attracting former TTP members, Pakistani Taliban. It adopts a hardline ideological position, and it portrays the Taliban as godless nationalists betraying the jihad. A strategy that worries the Taliban, and it inhibits any impulse that they may feel to take measures to control these groups or to compromise in other ways. As the monitoring team report mentions, ISIL-K also mounts operations designed to challenge regional security and the credibility of Taliban authority. It has support from ISIL core, some of it challenged through the ISIL Al-Qarar office, the AKO in Somalia. And many of you will have noted the recent US Special Forces operation that killed the AKO chief, Bilal al-Sudani, in Somalia, where the Americans explicitly linked that operation to the funding of terrorist activity in Afghanistan. Now, Marian has asked about specific questions about the divisions within the Taliban, and I want to be cautious with these. The monitoring team has written at length about diversity and dissent within the Taliban, and it does exist. Certainly, the group tends towards Pashtun chauvinism, and that is alienating Uzbek and Tajik Talibs, among others. There are also tribal complexities that Marian is much better qualified than I am to analyse. And then there are subgroups with degrees of autonomy, primarily the Haqqani network, which has always taken the lead in conducting relations with groups like Al-Qaeda. But it's easy to overstate how divided the Taliban are. what has been more striking throughout the insurgency and since they took power has been their self-discipline and their collective commitment to rule and to hold on to power. Now, one type of analysis that I try to avoid is moderates versus hardliners. I don't detect any closet liberals amongst the Taliban. Rather, there is a supreme leader in Kandahar, Hayatollah, who can challenge. Others work with and around his rulings. Some, like Defense Minister Yaqub, are ambitious for future promotion when Hayatollah leaves the scene eventually. The Haqqani network chief, Sirajuddin Haqqani, is more interested in using his group's autonomy to achieve objectives that judges are also in the interests of the Taliban. It remains to be seen whether his embarrassing by allowing Zawahiri to be detected and killed in Kabul will cause him difficulties. Siraj is not a moderate, but can be described as a pragmatist and an opportunist. This is how he has convinced some foreign interlocutors that he's part of the solution. I am intrigued by current media reports of Siraj and Yaqub dissenting from the Taliban approach to governance, but this still falls far short of a split, as far as I can see at this stage. So what is impacting the Taliban's relations and interaction with foreign terrorist groups present in Afghanistan? The most striking source of tension is between the Taliban's desire to maintain good relations with these old comrades in arms who supported it and helped it to take power, and the need to build relations with their neighbors. Is it possible to be friends both with Uzbek extremists and with Tashkent, with Uyghur extremists and Beijing? The case of the TTP suggests that this is a serious problem for Kabul. Efforts to broker an understanding between the TTP and Pakistan have failed because the TTP's demands are so outlandish that they're simply impossible for Islamabad to engage with. I don't want to sound dogmatic in this analysis when our knowledge of the foreign extremist landscape in Afghanistan is admittedly patchy. There are some indications that the Taliban worry about the intent of some of these groups, not just about ISIL-K. It has sought at times to take an inventory of their numbers and locations and to set guidelines as to what is and is not acceptable activity. When the Taliban took power, the Haqqanis secured the interior ministry and some other key portfolios, including passports, identity cards, refugees. It was reported that they intended to naturalize foreign fighters, which I suppose, in a way, would validate the claim that there are no foreign extremists in the country, taking foreign extremists and make them Afghan nationals. But this plan does not seem to have materialized fully, perhaps partly because of budgetary constraints. There's also the Taliban instinct to blackmail international partners and neighbors who disoblige them. So Dushanbe has accused them of positioning Tajik fighters near the border. Taliban are hostile to ISIL-K, but they may not feel equally concerned about all ISIL-K activity. It does suit their interests for the international community to fear ISIL-K. And ISIL-K, though threatening, lacks current capability. Making it the issue in Afghanistan is to let the tail wag the dog. Despite siren voices to the contrary, the counterterrorism partnership with the Taliban cannot become a load-bearing platform for a new understanding in the middle. What is needed is a hard slog to pressure and persuade the Taliban to behave better. 1988 sanctions, which the military team supports and is responsible for helping to implement, although they are not adapted to the new circumstances in Afghanistan, they do still offer important leverage. We can perhaps discuss later how they might be adapted. Meanwhile, the main effort in pressing the Taliban to amend its behaviour should be led by Afghanistan's neighbours. Their borders with Afghanistan are an inescapable reality. They have the transactional needs and the transactional tools to force a positive evolution in Afghanistan over time. And I think I could go into more, but I think I've used my 8 minutes. So I'll close there, and of course very much look forward to answering any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmund. I certainly hope that we, at the end, we get some time to get a little bit more, to hear a little bit more about you, particularly on the policy perceptions that you may have with regard to the analysis that you presented. Thank you. Let me turn to Sue and get a little bit more specific with the UN's role, specifically the monitoring role in what is going on right now. So Sue, it seems that we have this. To me, it seems like we have this dichotomy when it gets to how to deal with it. Now, on the one hand, from the United Nations side, we have Resolution 1988, which basically sanctions specific members. And then on the other hand, we have this necessity for really badly needed humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. But at the same time, we have these Taliban, many of them who are on the sanctions list, de facto administrators. Now, could you tell us a little bit first, if you could clarify very briefly what this 1988 sanctions regime is? Two, is it really fit anymore to be in operation, given the fact that it was adopted when the Taliban was an insurgent, not a de facto administration? And then thirdly, how that plays with resolution 2664 is 2664, which creates a carve out for humanitarian assistance, basically an exemption for that. If you could allude to all those issues, that would be great. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Arian. In 8 minutes, right? No, thank you, first of all, for organizing this session. I think it's very important. And I want to thank all of your colleagues at Princeton for hosting us. I think it's really important to go back and remember sort of what the basis of the sanctions were. They were originally imposed in response to the bombings of the U.S. Embassy in 1998. The original regime was created in the 1267 regime in 1999, and it was a situation in which it evolved over time.
Yeah,
sure, but again, it was imposed on the Taliban for refusing to turn over bin Laden. Then, as the regime evolved, it became a situation where in 2011, the regime split. Al-Qaeda and then what became more recently ISIL was the focus of one set of sanctions. And then 1988 regime focused specifically on Taliban. And the objective was to bring about sustainable and inclusive peace, stability, and security in Afghanistan. So the sanctions regime has largely stayed the same with those objectives. It includes an and a arms embargo. So we have the Taliban that has been sanctioned for a number of years. This is not something new. But all of a sudden, in August of 2021, you have many of the individuals who are on the sanctions list coming into positions of authority. I think initially it was somewhere around 21. We counted in April of 2022 that there were 41 members of the Taliban government who were listed by the 1988 regime. And then that number has now gone up to 71 currently. Of the 71 listed individuals, 29 hold cabinet level positions, cabinet level appointment. So it raises questions for NGOs who are providing humanitarian assistance and for the financial institutions who have to transfer the money in support of humanitarian efforts about who they were to deal with. Was it appropriate? Was it something that they could easily transfer the funds, even though they were for humanitarian purposes? At that time, there was no humanitarian exception for the sanctions. So recognizing the problems, the concerns that and in particular the humanitarian community had, the Council adopted in December of 2021 resolution 2615. And I think that was really important because it was a recognition that there needed to be a legal mechanism for humanitarian actors to be able to provide humanitarian assistance. And very, very much it was an important recognition because even prior to the takeover in Taliban, 75% of the Afghan economy was basically based on humanitarian proceeds going into the country. So the country, even before the takeover in Taliban, was extremely dependent on humanitarian assistance. So then we have a situation where the humanitarian, by the end of 2021, I believe, OCHA had estimated that more than half of the population was in need, was on the verge of starvation and in need of humanitarian assistance. So 2651 was a very important initiative supported by the Security Council. And in short order, the US, the EU, UK, other member states implemented the sanctions, the carve out to the sanctions. And it was for humanitarian assistance and other activities that support basic human needs in Afghanistan. But NGOs were also encouraged to use reasonable efforts to minimize the actual accrual of any benefit, whether as a result of provision of aid or diversion to individuals on the 1988 list. So here we have a situation where the sanctions continue, humanitarian aid needs to go in, and even with the humanitarian exception, there were continuing questions. So why hasn't the humanitarian exception, gotten to the point where it's actually, solved or eliminated some of the barriers that the NGOs face? And I think that we have to take a step back because sanctions are not the only thing that are going on here. First of all, you had a freeze of more than $9 billion of Afghan assets, external, but owned by the central bank. That also contributed to the liquidity crisis that took place in Afghanistan, even to the point now where the government is limiting the amount of money that can be taken out, limiting the use of any currency other than the Afghani. And I think even though we have, and it was very important to have financial institutions, the humanitarian exception, financial institutions are also risk adverse, and the environment is not a stable or a predictable one. But more than that, the sanctions, the humanitarian exception address sanctions, but not their requirement to prohibit any kind of material support to terrorists. And these are still entities which, well, for the EU, US, as terrorist entities. And then most recently, I think we've seen even the fact there have been the requirements by the Taliban of women not participating and being illegal or work for NGOs. Some NGOs have suspended their work because of that in Afghanistan. So there's a multitude of reasons why the humanitarian situation still remains critical. But I think that Kate will be able to address some of these issues that are on the ground. But the point is the sanctions are there. The monitoring team is trying to call attention when there are, say, for example, violations of the travel ban. There's been a great deal of confusion, if you will, or at least the Taliban using the humanitarian exception to say, oh, well, we're traveling to provide this or that related to humanitarian. That's not covered by the carve out. It relates only to financial assets. And the member states need to apply for an exception for a travel by listed entities. So there's a multitude of reasons. The sanctions are one piece of this, but they're a very important piece because, as Edmund said, they do provide some degree of leverage in terms of what appropriate activity or appropriate behavior is that for the international community. And I'll stop there then.
Thank you, Sue, for clarifying the regime and some of the main points pertaining to the regime of 1988 and how it creates certain issues here right now. Let me, since we talk about that, let me turn to Kate now. Kate, you're on the ground and you are there doing it all. First of all, let me thank you for the great work that you help that you're extending on a daily basis to very needy people. Thank you for that. Now, let me ask you, when it comes to this issue of sanctions, I mean, you're probably dealing with some of these individuals that are on the sanctions list and that are also in cabinet positions. And not only the UN, but also many of these other aid organizations, donor organizations that are engaged still in Afghanistan, they have to deal with it. How does that work on the ground? What does that mean these restrictions and the need for the delivery of aid at an operational level on the ground?
Thank you, Ariane. I hope you can all hear me. Maybe just to clarify that I'm actually not in Kabul right now. I'm actually in London, which is probably a good thing because it's almost 3 in the morning, I think, right now in Afghanistan. But just to clarify, maybe, and thank all distinguished guests also for their comments so far. So, I mean, I think a little bit sort of to what Sue said also about the sort of need to take a step back maybe and clarify the nature of the restrictions and understand where humanitarian organizations are situated in that context. So, I mean, you know, obviously, as Sue pointed out, 1988 has 3 types of restrictions, right? An arms embargo, a travel ban designated individuals, and then obviously financial sanctions. And they are the most critical element for humanitarian partners, right? Because they make, essentially what they do is they say that you cannot transfer funds or assets to designated individuals or entities. Now, we have the humanitarian exception, which essentially nullifies a financial sanction if those funds or assets are being transferred in support of humanitarian assistance or in support of activities that support basic human needs. So from a legal perspective, you know, we are on pretty good ground. We're in a much better place and space than some other countries which face much more far-reaching sanctions. Just to sort of clarify again, these are very targeted. There are 135 individuals, there are 5 entities, including their Kani network. So they're very limited in number as well. So I think just that's an important point to situate sort of where we sit. Now, obviously, a really important component of this is there's never been any prohibition on contact. Contacting, engaging with the de facto authorities as part of our humanitarian work has never been prohibited. The fact that some people may think that it is often more a reflection of people don't like the fact that there has to be some kind of engagement. But we do have in a series of US General License FAQs, the US have very helpfully pointed out a whole range of activities and types of engagement that are authorized. This includes, for example, attending donor meetings. It includes participation in technical working groups. It includes sharing office space with the de facto authorities. It includes a whole range of activities, also training. So the notion in that sense that legally we are confined is probably not as accurate. I think what we tend to see and what humanitarian organizations tend to face in terms of problems, and we'll get to bank de-risking in a second perhaps, is sometimes often what we see is countries holding up sanctions as the reasons why something can't be done. Normally it's because they don't want to fund a particular activity, and they do that in the name of sanctions. Or sanctions prevent us from doing this, when actually there's no prohibition. So one of the very important things we've also spent time clarifying with our partners is that the sanctions do not even address, let alone prohibit, humanitarian development action. They prohibit making funds or assets available to designated entities. So this notion that we can't do humanitarian or development assistance is not accurate in terms of the law. It may be that member states don't want to fund it, but that's a very different thing entirely. Generally speaking, what we have seen is a reluctance from member states to fund development activities. I'm not here talking about bilateral development cooperation with the Taliban as a governing entity, but just in terms of activities that development partners would normally undertake, we tend to see a reluctance from member states to fund that. With humanitarian activities, I think generally speaking, there's been very widespread recognition of the gravity of the situation in the country. We now have 28.3 million people in need. We have more than half the population hungry. 6 million people one step away from famine. These are some of the sort of starkest numbers that we have globally in terms of needs. So we have seen, generally speaking, a much more open stance from member states on funding humanitarian activities. Not across the board. We have seen, for example, some reluctance to fund mine action activities. But generally speaking, we do find an acknowledgement that we can't make it harder than it already is for organizations on the ground to get the funds that they need in order to provide the assistance that people need. Now, Sue mentioned the challenge that our partners face in terms of bank de-risking. We do see that as a continued challenge, despite the fact that we have the humanitarian exception 2615 actually was very critical in terms of the language that it used. It referred to the fact that the processing and payment of funds was permitted. This was important for banks to be able to move forward. The processing actually was a new word that was included in the resolution for the first time. It also covered commercial providers, assistance, not just NGOs or UN agencies. So we do see quite a broad permission, so to speak, probably the broadest that we actually have seen. I've seen a tool from the Security Council, and that's very welcome. Now, in terms of what we can do to support, and we are doing this at the moment, I think, as the UN on the ground. One, we try and familiarise all stakeholders with the letter of the law, and this is to both our partners, our NGO partners, national and international, who may not be so familiar with sanctions regimes or humanitarian exceptions, who don't have legal advisors, often don't have very many international staff. So spend a lot of time with them, familiarising them with this and doing regular sort of sensitization sessions. We also do it with donors and with member states as well, who themselves may also not be familiar with the letter of the law. And we do this also to give our partners confidence to push back on sometimes suggestions that sanctions are the reasons why we can't do something, when very often it's a policy decision at play. And that's just the reality of the world that we live in. So we do work very, very hard on that. Now, the other thing that we do, and Sue also mentioned this is the fact that just because the exception says that you can transfer funds, assets to listed individuals, doesn't mean that you should, right? Avoid it if you can. So another thing that we also do with partners is we try and get them to strengthen the due diligence processes that they have. We also encourage them to cooperate fully with banks on all of the questions that they ask. Banks tell us all the time that, you know, sanctions compliance is upstream work, takes a lot of time. The exception has been critical to keeping them in the Afghanistan game, but as Sue mentioned, they are commercial actors. You can't force them to do anything. They have lots of considerations at play when they're taking a decision as to whether or not they transact with organizations who are operating in Afghanistan. So what we try and do is also create a community of practice with our NGO partners to, I think, you know, work with them to understand what is working, what isn't working in terms of transactions. Are there some banks which are friendlier, more willing to do that? Are there currencies in which transaction can work better than in others? So that's all sort of part of the practical work that we do on the ground to sort of support our partners. And we undertake a access to financial services survey every 6 months as well, which we sort of use as a way of trying to better understand where the problem really lies. And generally speaking, it lies with the correspondent banks, the intermediary banks, which are sort of a very amorphous space, very hard to identify, and it's not always easy to get to grips with particular problems or sticking points. But nevertheless, that is something that we do, and we do find that some member states are taking a very sort of forward-leaning and proactive stance and engaging with those financial institutions to try and encourage them also to re-engage with us. And then just maybe lastly, and one of the other things obviously I think that the UN can do and is doing as well, and again this is sort of the final part of the exception, but in a way maybe the most important part, which is about how can we reassure member states that we are taking the steps that we need to minimize the accrual of funds to individuals, even though it's allowed. And that is sort of obviously a work in progress. The ERC is mandated by the exception to brief the Security Council every 6 months on the implementation 2615. He's done 2 so far, he'll be doing another one in June. And that really is also our opportunity to demonstrate to council members, you know, what it is exactly that our partners are doing to minimize the risk of diversion. And so there we encourage the sharing also of concrete examples. If you look at the ERC's most recent briefing in December, he gave quite a few that our partners do to sort of try and compare, for example, bills pre-August 2021 with bills now. They take steps to actually directly contract and pay service providers and pay for the supplies and procurement of goods rather than transferring funds to line ministries. I think just one last thing maybe to clarify before I close, I think, you know, there is a sort of perception with the sanctions that organizations transferring funds to listed individuals as individuals. That's not the case. Transferring funds to line ministries that happen to be headed by listed individuals. And this is a practice that took place prior to August 2021 and is a practice that continues today. And one of the things that we also do with our partners regularly is a spot check to make sure that the modalities of payment are the same now as they were 18, 20 months ago as well. So there are, very practical things that we're doing and working with NGOs and with UN agencies on. It is a sort of constant work stream in that sense due to turnover. We'll be in a job for some time, I suspect. But, I think that there have been some very positive steps taken so far. And obviously, as a humanitarian practitioner, as someone who has lived in Afghanistan for 4 of the last 7 years, and both pre and post Taliban, I think obviously we're keen to not see any obstacles put in the way of the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and that's been our consistent message to member states and donor countries for the past 18 months, which is that it's very hard as it is for us to be able to operate in country. We have a range of restrictions as well, and some of them are coming from different angles, and what we try and do is keep the path as clean as possible to allow us to provide goods in a timely and effective manner. Over from my side.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate, for clarifying quite a lot of practical operational issues when it comes to aid delivery and like sanctions. There simply seems to be, among the ordinary normal people like myself, there seems to be quite a lot of misunderstanding how these things actually work on the ground. So we appreciate that. I'm pretty sure there will be more questions for you in the Q&A. Now let me turn to Fernando. So back to OCT, Office of Counterterrorism, back in New York. In the last report recently, Under-Secretary General Mr. Gromko presented the last UN report on the threat of Daesh. And also in that presentation, he urges a lot of international cooperation on the implementation of the UN strategic counterterrorism, UN counterterrorism strategy, Ambassador Jimenez pointed out. Now, how do you see the current threat environment? Edmund talked about the operation of certain terrorist groups there, the Taliban in power now, a new threat environment is emerging from Afghanistan that obviously affects the region and much beyond. How do you see that impacts the effective implementation of the UN counterterrorism strategy, and particularly if you could talk from the perspective of the UN OCT and what the UN OCT can do on that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ariane, once again for the invitation today, for extending this to UN OCT, and it's a pleasure to be here today. It's very difficult, of course, to come in after the panelists in this section today. Yeah, sure. Can you hear me now? Is it better? But I suppose that the silver lining is that it's a bit easier to try and distill some of these topics because they have already been elaborated by the speakers. And to your question, I think that the very short answer for the section would be that the key challenge for the implementation of the strategy in Afghanistan at this stage, if we were to single out the major one, is essentially the lack of the Taliban, the de facto authorities of the country, to demonstrate their commitments to counterterrorism and to uphold their responsibility in implementing their strategy. As has already been very nicely articulated by Ambassador Jimenez, the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy is an intergovernmental instrument. It offers a framework, both at the policy and operational level, for member states to address the issue of terrorism, to counter terrorism and violent extremism. It's quite comprehensive. It addresses a number of different issues and topics along the 4 pillars mentioned by the ambassador. But by virtue of that being an intergovernmental instrument, it is, of course, a primary responsibility of member states to implement state strategy. And if the de facto authorities have not necessarily shown this strategy convincingly, that's definitely a problem. And relating to this, the threat environment, I think it has already, some elements of this inability to display has already been mentioned. For example, the situation of human rights that's impacting, in particular, the role of women and girls in the country, and now impacting even more even the delivery of humanitarian assistance in the country, but the impact that some of these measures have had on NGOs in the country is quite telling. There is, of course, the other element of the presence of a number of these terrorist groups in Afghanistan, and the fact that al-Zawahiri was killed in an operation last year in Afghanistan is another reminder about the lack of commitment of the authorities to sever ties with Al-Qaeda. And as you may know, this has already been something that has been raised on a number of occasions by the Security Council in terms of demanding that the Taliban sever these ties and that the Afghanistan soil not be used for terrorist purposes. So that's the key impediment to the work of, to the implementation of this strategy. And in terms of the role of OCT in all that, perhaps it's useful to clarify where we stand and what is it that the Office of Counterterrorism does among the constellation of entities in the UN system. Our office was created in 2017, so it came as one of the major and initial reform initiatives of the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. It tried to streamline into consolidate all the range of activities that the UN does in the area of counterterrorism, and we have a few different functions in that regard. It includes providing leadership in the implementation across the UN system on the mandates, on the counterterrorism mandates entrusted by the General Assembly to the Secretary General. We have a function to provide coordination to ensure coherent and consistent support across the UN system in the delivery of their CT mandates. We, of course, provide capacity building support to member states, including to make sure and to ensure that the integrated and balanced implementation of the strategy itself. And we are also mandated to sustain attention on issues relating to counterterrorism and to mobilize resources for these initiatives across the whole UN system. So with all this in mind and within the boundaries of this mandate, we do not have activities and programs in Afghanistan at the moment. And we also don't have plans to implement any of these activities. As long as the Taliban remains subject to UN sanctions, as long as the ties with Al-Qaeda and the relations with other terrorist groups are not severed as well. And as long as, of course, the Taliban and de facto authorities continue with the severe abuses of human rights in the country. So it doesn't mean that we do not engage. It means that we do not engage necessarily with the government of the country, with the Taliban de facto authorities, considering the challenges that I've already mentioned, their lack of concrete measures to demonstrate their commitment to uphold their CT obligations internationally. And the way we engage is precisely focusing on the neighboring countries. The threats that's posed by these groups in Afghanistan is a threat not only restricted to that country, but it's also to the neighborhood as well as beyond. So we work with a number of these countries in the region to strengthen their capacities in a number of areas to counter terrorism and to counter the threat emanating from Afghanistan. So the whole range of capacity building supports that we provide to some of these countries include anything relating to the prosecution, rehabilitation, registration of terrorist fighters and former terrorist fighters. We work in the area of border security, small arms and light weapons, countering the financing of terrorism, as well as preventing terrorist travel. So we focus on addressing the threat from the neighborhood. In addition to this direct provision of capacity building support, we have also partnered with the UN Regional Center for Preventive Diplomacy for Central Asia in the launch of a network. We call this the Counterterrorism Early Warning Network for Central Asia. And the idea is precisely to address the threats emanating from Afghanistan directly. And what this network focuses on is essentially it serves as a platform for sharing experiences, analyzing the threat, which is the first step to design policies to counter them, of course, as well as to provide joint recommendations on how these member states can jointly address the threat posed by Afghanistan. So I think this covers most of the work that we're doing in Afghanistan, on Afghanistan to counter the threat. And final point, perhaps just to mention that as part of this network, we're also doing some research precisely to try and understand how is it that our engagement with those countries may have a more efficient impact on the ground and bring the results that we're expecting to bring under the current circumstances.
Great, thank you, Fernando. Thank you for the information, both in terms of your assessment and also the information on some of the issues that the UNOCT is currently doing in the world with regard to that. With that, let me open the floor for questions both here and also among our audiences who are following us through Zoom. I did have a couple of other questions that I just wanted to pose it to the entire panel, but let's open it to the audience, and if I get the chance, then I'll ask my questions at the end. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. My name is Salah Fayyad. I'm on the faculty of the school here. If there are no students who want to begin, usually there's tradition of allowing students first to ask. In any event, I'll go ahead and very quickly. I have a two-part question, as my friend. And I was intrigued by the comment made by Ambassador Eden Brown about Taliban needing assistance, maybe wanting it, but on their own terms. Thinking about that, actually, that's not unique of this potential aid recipient. Most aid recipients would, if not all of them, would want aid on their own terms. And the same thing can be said about aid providers. They are willing, when they're willing to provide aid, do so on their own terms. When aid is given and received, that is usually a product of some negotiation. I also was in this context intrigued by what you said about there not being skeleton moderates, but if I understood you correctly, you said something about there being some elements of pragmatism. I guess that's what we're looking for in response to the basic point asked by the moderator. By the way, great panel, thank you very much for all the contribution. And Ariana as well should have started with that for bringing this event to the school as great event. To his point, what can possibly be done given all of these difficulties? It seems to me if there is in fact truth to there being elements of pragmatism within what we're looking at and that they are in control, that's what I believe should be looked into carefully. The related question very quickly, point of the difficulty posed by some of these actors being on the boycott list, restricted. And the point is, when the world had a regime it recognized in Afghanistan, the bulk of the aid did not go to the regime directly. It did not go to the coffers of the government. It went to Afghanistan through some other channel, implemented directly through whatever, civil society, contractors, and what have you. It didn't go to the government itself. So it seems to me, if the world were to really adopt an approach like this to the provision of aid to Afghanistan at the juncture, it would not be doing something out of the ordinary, given its long-standing record of having done so, not mainly for the government. Your comments on this, if I may. Once again, thank you very much for this.
Yeah, I mean, so let me take the first couple of points because I think they were drawn from your observations on what I said. And points. When I said that they wanted assistance but on their own terms, I wasn't making a general comment about aid. I was thinking more about counterterrorism assistance because that's and there we have a slightly different paradigm. There used to be a lot of counterterrorism assistance to the former government of Afghanistan, and in order to engage not just effectively but also actually legally in counterterrorism, you need certain concessions, certain assurances from the partner working within the country. And at the moment, there's just no sign that the Taliban can offer that kind of willingness. It's sort of you know, we have this, we acknowledge that there is a presence of ISIL from some. If you want us to be effective, then you need to give us more help. But you know, we'll keep you out of our business and we'll do it our own way. And of course, we know what that means. That leads to, you know, sort of random roundups and people being badged as terrorists because they're doing something that's inconvenient. So that's why I think it's a real problem here in building a counter-terrorism relationship with Taliban. And then, oh, sorry, on the second point, just very quickly about pragmatism, I completely agree. And that's why I always emphasize the role of the neighbours, because by definition, neighbourly relations are pragmatic. You have to deal with the border. You have to deal with, you know, water courses. You have to deal with trade and smuggling and things of that kind. And you form relationships through that. And that's where you get the pragmatism. So, you know, I make no particular comment on Sirajuddin Haqqani. I think he's obviously a very capable individual. I just don't term moderate for him because I think that misrepresents his whole history. Thank you.
I would just stress that, correct, that the humanitarian assistance that was going in before was going for the benefit of individuals. It was often going through ministries, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, etc. And there were questions that arose then when those individuals were sanctioned were now the ministers of those agencies. I think by and large that, you know, that a number of those things have been clarified through the humanitarian exception, through greater understanding, through what Kate and her colleagues are doing to try to explain what the sanctions require, but also what the humanitarian exception allows. What I would say, though, is that there is a problem in that there have been efforts, the UN and the World Bank, for example, worked on a mechanism called the Humanitarian Exchange Facility to create a mechanism to get humanitarian aid in a way, though, that did not go through the Taliban. And the central bank and DAB refused to move forward on it because they were fearful that it was, instead of a temporary mechanism as it was intended, that it would be somehow or other circumvent the normal financial system. What they wanted is normalcy of the financial system. But that's not happened because there's not confidence of the banks and others to re-engage. So it's been a situation where, you know, a big problem has been created by the Taliban itself by refusing to move forward on some of these mechanisms that could have facilitated the broader provision.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this very stimulating presentation. In the year and a half since the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan faded away, other events have happened in the world, and I think particularly of Eastern Europe, that have deepened the chasm between the major powers on the Security Council. Yet one has the sense that on Afghanistan, even though one or another might initially have been looking to see there was some space they could carve out with the new government, that there seems to be pretty much still consensus. Are the major powers in the Security Council still on the same page with regard to Afghanistan, and the neighbors immediately adjacent, are they on board? And allow me to piggyback a second question, which is, in those 18 months, have the Taliban remained energetic in trying to ferret out any former officials or soldiers of the deposed republic and bring them to what would be a Taliban justice? Or have they now moved on?
Yeah, thank you. On that, sorry, can you just repeat the first part of the question again?
The first question was, are the powers that in other respects are deeply divided, are they still all on the same page on Afghanistan?
So it was interesting that obviously I was serving for a year after the Taliban took over, so I sort of watched the way that evolved for the first year, and then for the past 8 months or so, I've been sort of a more distant observer. but you're absolutely right. It's extraordinary considering the amount of difficulty that exists with the Security Council, that there isn't more manifest tension on Afghan issues. And what we saw was that there was a sort of a really pragmatic approach within the Security Council. What they did, they tried to take but as various deadlines came up and things needed to be renewed, they would take them on and roll them over, effectively sort of say, that's okay, we'll do that again for 3 months, 6 months, 1 year period, or whatever it was. And I think what that reflected was that whilst there's a certain amount of manoeuvring, of course, within the international community to try to gain some advantage, comparative advantage in this context, I think everybody can see that this is a difficult situation and nobody really wants to take ownership of it because it's a difficult situation. And in those circumstances, the hardest thing to achieve is something more ambitious, where you actually change gear and introduce a new policy. And I would say probably the most ambitious thing that the Security Council did after the Taliban took over was to pass the humanitarian exemption resolution. I think that was the most creative and the most demanding thing. And that was passed in December of 2021. Other than that, once you start to raise issues like, should we be looking at drawing down the 1988 sanctions regime? Should we be looking at large-scale delistings? Or should we be looking at more listings? As soon as you get into that sort of territory, it's difficult to make people draw back from taking on this issue.
Thanks for the questions. To be along what Ambassador said, I fully agree with his points. I think that from our point of view, we are not a member of the Security Council, but we follow the work of the Security Council very closely. And I totally agree that we have seen a sort of a responsible approach from members of the Security Council when it comes to crucial issues for international peace and security, including the renewal of different mandates. Discussions can be more difficult. Maybe the period of the extension can be limited instead of maybe a 1 year extension. At some points now we are getting a 6 month because some members of the Security Council want to use some leverage and to have the opportunity to examine this question in the near future. But it's true that I think that P5 and some of the P5 specifically, like they choose their battles very strategically, and they know where they can put on more of a show, if I may say so. And we have seen very recent examples of public meetings of the Security Council on some issues in which that was the case. But then when it comes to negotiations behind closed doors, I think that they realize that they have a huge responsibility and that they cannot fail in their fulfillment of that responsibility.
Just to point out that that the Security Council now for the past 2 years in December 2021 and 2022 largely continued to just pass a rollover of the sanctions. And I do think that a number of countries are, the reality on the ground is that the very people who were targeted and were sanctioned are now the de facto administration. And so the question that that was posed, and I didn't address, but is the regime fit for purpose? I think that that's the question that members of the council have to address, is whether or not this coming December, whether or not the regime is fit for purpose. I think many people look at it and say it's not, but then the question is, what is a consensus about where it should go? And those are very difficult political questions, which are not the domain of the monitoring team. So member states, I think, will be engaging in these discussions over the next, 9 months.
So, if I may just a quick follow-up. So it's a political in the sense of concern about legitimizing. It's a distinction between legality and legitimacy. So there, what do you say, political?
I think it's a full range of issues.
Yeah.
There is not a consensus among member states to recognize that has held for now the entire time and no one is calling for, serious recognition. But I do think there are a number of questions, and those are very difficult questions that the member states will have to address.
Short of recognition, part of what is being talked about is it concerned that by extending aid to Afghanistan at this stage, in the way it might be done, or ends up being done, or is being done, the concern that might actually prolong Taliban's rule, compare some legitimacy on it. Is that something that is concern talked about? Is that what is inhibiting the process? And that's what I'm trying to make, what distinguish the legality and question of conferring legitimacy on the Taliban regime.
I don't think in any way, shape, or form that the passage of the humanitarian carve-out in any way dealt with the legitimacy question. In fact, this was another policy objective of the international community to not let, half of the Afghan population be in dire straits. It is clear that there are situations in which providing humanitarian assistance may alleviate something for the regime. Those are serious questions, but I think that NGOs are providing the assistance to the Afghan people. And that's what the process has been, is to try to avoid any kind of benefit to the Taliban regime.
We've got just about 3 to 4 minutes. There are some questions here. Let me read a couple very quickly from here, and then we get a question from Wahid, and if you can just answer that very quickly. So one of the questions here is with regard to the divisions of the Taliban. What is going to happen in the future? Is it going to be negotiation, a coup, civil war within the Taliban, rather? And then I'm going to read one question with regard to the humanitarian issue. So MC Nahid Farid, who is also a member of the Policy Lab, is asking if humanitarian assistance could be used as a leverage to help Afghan women rather than strengthening or legitimizing the Taliban. Those two questions, Wahid, if you want to hold a quick question, and then we'll.
Partially, my question was also to follow up to what FP said. So there's humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is a reality that everybody knows. But is the UN out of option to deal with the Taliban? And that is the only excuse, because I haven't heard anything. We talked about 20 other terrorist groups are in Afghanistan. Maybe the whole number of all these 20 the terrorist groups are not more than 1 battalion of suicide attackers of Taliban, which are officially part of their government. But now we are not talking with the Taliban as a terrorist group. We're calling it a de facto power, which is also a reality. And what they are doing against women, what they are doing against the people of Afghanistan. So is the world kind of out of option to deal with the Taliban?
Okay, these the 3 questions are sort of related to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think is out of options, and that comes back to the question about whether humanitarian assistance might be helping to prolong the Taliban power. I don't really think so. I think nobody that I speak to seriously imagines that there's going to be change in the governance of Afghanistan in the near future. And I don't hear anyone in the international community with an appetite for trying to find a way back into intervention in Afghanistan after the experience of 2 decades. Are we out of options? I mean, there's something in that. You have limited leverage. What can you do? But I think we have offered a few suggestions in terms of pragmatic engagement, neighbor-led engagement. And I think we have to deal with the Taliban on its merits. And I think that the sort of criticism that is made of the Taliban whenever they do the various things that they do that sort of set back their quest for recognition, the message is being sent to them. again and again that some things might work and other things won't work. It's not going to be quick though. There's no magic bullet.
I think we might just want to bring Kate in to address the question about humanitarian assistance, though.
Thanks, Sue. I mean, look, I can be very brief. I mean, in short, no. I mean, humanitarian assistance by its very nature is built on the principle of humanity, which is about need. So any kind of politicization of humanitarian assistance is something that we, advocate very strongly against. And just to sort of also clarify, because I think maybe there also maybe some misunderstandings about what we mean by aid. When we talked about Afghanistan being aid dependent in terms of pre-Taliban, so under the Ghani administration, talking about bilateral cooperation here. This is assistance that went directly from member states to the government as part of on-budget support under, for example, governance or security sector reform, or for basic systems, including, for example, the basic package of health services under the BPHS. Which was supported by the ARTF, the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. This is not humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian assistance by its nature never goes to the authorities, whether they're the Ghani government or the Republic or the Emirate. They go to NGOs and UN agencies who then implement directly. So this notion that somehow if we stop giving aid to the people who are in need of it, we will elicit some kind of positive change in behavior, I think is built on a misconception and a misunderstanding about how aid actually is delivered in a humanitarian sense in country. If what you're talking about is can we elicit a change in behavior by turning the tap on of development assistance to the government or de facto authorities or lack thereof, that's a question for member states to decide on the back of their own policy. I do think that we need to be conscious about how we also think about eliciting positive change and also think about have the efforts of the past 18 months brought about any positive change, because there's always this talk about leverage, but often it doesn't actually exist as well. We certainly as humanitarians always insist that humanitarian assistance remains separate to any conversations on the political track for very obvious reasons. We don't want it to become seen as something that may or may not bring about a positive change in behavior. But I think, we may want to look at the lessons of the last 18 months in terms of what we have seen, in terms of the trajectory that the authorities have taken, and consider whether or not we actually think that that kind of pressure will help as well. Unfortunately, the de facto authorities have demonstrated they're relatively impervious to external pressure, external condemnation. So we certainly don't want to invoke the needs of the Afghan people in that conversation. We want to ensure that we're able to assist them wherever they may reside, regardless of the province, regardless of their background, on the basis of of the principles of humanity, basically impartiality, neutrality, and independence. That's how we operate. So from our perspective, we're very clear also about the fact that there is no conferring of legitimacy by giving humanitarian assistance to people in need. What you may be talking about is member states not wanting to normalize their own relationship with the de facto authorities, and they would do that in the forms of different types of assistance or cooperation. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about delivering aid to people in need.
Thank you. Ambassador, would you
The last point,
Absolutely.
just to try to respond to the question, about how to deal with the situation if we have run out of options, and also to very much agree with has been said already by Sue, the ambassador, about the pragmatic approach, about building relations with neighbors. From our point of view, it's very important the unity of the international community to make sure that as time passes by and the complexity of the issue probably will only get more difficult, that the international community stays engaged in the views of other pressing needs and on the issue of Afghanistan speaks with one voice, and also in terms of enlarging the conversation to other actors as important as neighbors are. We also think that there's potential to engage more with the organization of the Islamic Conference and have other actors involved in trying to keep this issue, as I said, not to normalize the issue. But I think that's one of the dangers for us, that we get used to this business as usual for Afghanistan, and this shouldn't be the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We are definitely out of time, and with that, let me thank again our panelists and our keynote speaker, Ambassador Anna Pettis, Dr. Sue Eckert, Ms. Catherine Perry, who actually works in Kabul but is in London right now, and Ambassador Edmund Cullen Brown, and last but not least, Dr. Fernando Cavalcante. Thank you for coming in here and for joining us. Thank you all.
Thanks.
So